Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we are pro-freedom and anti-coercion. This is episode 66, and we're going to talk about segregation in the school cafeteria, voluntary or coerced. And it's Monday, which means that it's race day, where we focus on a race-related topic. And today it's going to be segregation. So segregation, according to the dictionary, is setting apart, separation of things or people from others or main body or group based on a certain characteristic. And because of our understanding of race, right, which is basically a categorization or a generalization based on a single identifiable characteristic, anything can be a racialization. And so if you think about that, segregation happens all of the time, right? Jocks over there, cheerleaders over there, geeks over here, etc. It happens all the time. But people only care when it's skin color. And so people who walk into a cafeteria and they can see that certain colors are generally gravitating to one part of the cafeteria and everyone else to another, then it's a problem, right? It's segregation based on color. I think this topic was inspired by Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. One of the two first said that Sunday morning at 11 a.m., that's the most segregated hour in the country. That was around 1960. Well, sort of being inspired by this, in 1997, Beverly Tatum, discussed this sort of segregation in school cafeterias. Okay. She revisited the piece in 2017, so we'll get back to her. But in 2009, there was an article, Separate Tables, Why Black and White High Schoolers Sit Apart in the Cafeteria. And the article itself points out that there are many exceptions, just as I said before. Jocks, you got jocks sitting with other jocks, geeks with other geeks, Asians. Oh, wow, look, yellow people. Hey, Asians sitting apart. Common language and culture probably has a big part or has a lot to do with that. And these are categories which are significant to the student, right? To the race scholar, they're not looking for jocks and geeks or even Asians, right? They're not thinking about culture, musical taste, future plans. They're not thinking about that. Excuse me. They're only looking at skin color. And so that's why they're going to make the observations that they make. October Sky is a great movie. And also there are a lot of lunchroom scenes there. And you can see that even though everyone is white at the school, you have the geeks and one part of the cafeteria, and then all of the cool kids on another, and then I guess everyone in between in the middle. So in other words, you do see segregation even when everyone is the same skin color. But according to all of these people, it's a problem. So Beverly Tatum revisits her original article that she wrote in 1997. She revisits it in 2017. And the title of the piece that was released on NPR News by Tom Weber, it was called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" That was the title of the article. And so for the article, people self-segregating is a problem. And so because it's a problem, the solution that's offered is that people should get together with other people who are completely different from them 4 times a year, right? So they give examples of how this person went out of their way to meet someone who is quote unquote different. And I'm going to say different skin color, okay? Different, and with the purpose of trying to meet that person, okay? And so some people might say, oh, yeah, that's really cool. Let's do that. Well, newsflash, okay, I'm pretty busy. A lot of my relatives are busy. And some of them, I'll be lucky if I see them once every 4 years, right? If that, if there's no funeral in the family calendar. So okay, I barely have time to meet my own family members, yet I'm supposed to set aside time to meet complete strangers. Yeah, I'm not buying it, right? But they take the step further. They say, schools should do that, right? Because I mean, come on, what's a school for? Education? No, it's to carry out the prescriptions of these scholars, right? So students should be forced to meet other people who look different from them, right? Who are different color and get together 4 times during the school year. So they're trying to undo the sort of reinforcing of racial dynamics that they see in the cafeteria, right? Uh, so, okay, racial dynamics in the cafeteria, or is it simply a reflection of personal values that are played out in the cafeteria, right? And so we see here an intolerance of seeing kids doing what they want. There's an article in 2013 by Ben DeVore. He says diversity brings more segregation in large schools. And so his complaint was it should be more diverse, right? So, okay, so there is a kind of diversity, some measure of diversity, but it should be more diverse, right? It's not enough diversity, more cowbell, so you see that phenomenon. So, but if you look at it very closely, and if you see how things play out, uh, people are trying to foster a kind of monoculture, right? A certain kind of diversity, an authoritarian diversity, which isn't diversity at all. In 2022, NPR had an article. It was, let's see, the student population, the US student population is more diverse, but schools are still highly segregated. And they talk about a racial divide exacerbated by districting. Minority kids are attending largely segregated schools, and I suppose that means monocolor schools, segregated by. But what they forget is that these schools are populated by students determined by government rules and regulations and the school districts themselves, right? So there's this weird diversion, attempt to shift the focus away from the schools themselves to this sort of boogeyman of racism. And they go on to talk about how, because of districting, poor schools have fewer resources and therefore suffer as a result of wealthier schools, excuse me, that are located in wealthier districts, which is, I don't know, a red herring, maybe, because we all know that a lot of the administrators in those so-called poor districts make a lot of money, right? So is it really budget levels, right? Because some of the most poorest neighborhoods in the country have the worst performing schools, right? Even though the funding for each student is $30,000 per student, right? Still, that district's students are the worst performing, among the worst performing in the country. And of course, the worst district in the country is Washington, D.C., the only district which is directly controlled by the federal government, and it is among the worst. So that says something. So this whole less resources argument is kind of a red herring. It's a distraction. It tries to put the blame somewhere else, maybe to justify increased spending for education, when we know that most of that money, sort of like money going to Ukraine, doesn't go to the actual student, it rather goes to administration. But the author here in 2022, they're tying it to Jim Crow, which is interesting, right? Okay, so let's take a step back. This is pretty much a survey across 25 years of literature on the subject. So let's take a step back. I mentioned this already, but Milton Friedman, who's a free market guy most of the time, Chicago school economics, so a lot of Austrian school people don't like him that much. especially because of his monetary theory. But anyway, so Milton Friedman said that when you have freedom, there's a kind of organic kind of diversity that appears, sort of like spontaneous order. It's an order that you can't plan, but nevertheless, there it is. And it harkens back to the video that I talked about earlier. And if you go to YouTube and type in Amsterdam, I'll do it right now. Amsterdam. Let's see. There it is. Port of Amsterdam time lapse sale 2015. And if you watch that, we talked about it before, but if you watch that video you can find it on YouTube easily. You'll see that Amsterdam is the busiest port in the world, they say. And all of the rules governing traffic in the port are not from the government. They are basically organically developed rules by the people who actually have to use the port. And so because of that, what you see is an incredible diversity in the types of ships that are traveling the sea lanes within the port. Fast ships, slow ships, big ships, little ships, old ships, new ships, all of that mixed together, jumbled together, and hardly any accidents, if any at all, right? They're very, like the whole time I watched that video, I didn't see a single accident. And it's very chaotic, right? But it's organically diverse. It's a diversity that happened as a result of the free choices of the ship captains that are piloting the ships and taking them into port. And so the theory is that the kind of diversity that you would see in schools, if parents were allowed to choose the school that their kids go to, would be something very similar. Okay, so the organic diversity that that one would have with freedom looks more like the kind of diversity that a lot of these authoritarian scholars are trying to achieve through coercion. But if through coercion, you can't get that same kind of sort of organically developed diversity. But again, as we talked about before, most scholars will only focus on the color, the skin color. I mean, think about it, even the Asian table, come on. Asia, which stretches from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska all the way to Turkey, right? And everything in between, including, yes, Russia and the Ukraine, they're Asians, okay? According to geography, the way I learned it, okay? Right, you have this incredible diversity, but they're all just Asians. So that's the Asian table. And it falls apart very, very quickly, if you understand what I mean. And so what you're going to do is you're going to ignore that and just simply look according to the rules of observation that you have determined for yourself. But there are many different kinds of diversity. And as we said before, even in a school where everyone is white, you will have social cliques and they will sort of segregate themselves according to their social clique. The Breakfast Club is a movie from the 80s that comes to mind that addresses this very issue. It is possible that even this discussion on segregation in the school cafeteria is the result of professors, scholars who need to get tenure, who need to publish or die, right? They're looking for problems to justify their own existence. And once they identify a problem, as we discussed earlier, they're going to propose a solution, which is then going to be imposed and prescribed onto students in schools, regardless of the results, right? Regardless of the results. Now, why do I say that? Well, because I know this impulse. I know this phenomena really, really well because I did it too, except because I was also a pastor, because I am also a pastor of a church, I would, apply a lot of the things that I learned in school in my congregation. The difference is that I didn't double down. I didn't, when things were turning out badly, I immediately changed course. Most other people, it doesn't matter, right? Because their funding, their grants, their tenure, whatever, is dependent on them doubling down on whatever theory they came up with. I mean, what scholar is going to willingly admit that they were wrong? But of course, in a church setting, the stakes are different. And the goal is to help people live their lives. And if the results that you're getting are more detrimental for the people that you were trying to help, then immediately you make an adjustment. Yeah, you never see that in government or in schools. So it's possible that professors are simply prescribing solutions so they can get tenure, so they can get a publication deal, so they can be appointed to some committee at some conference or whatever. It's very possible, even likely, but we won't go there yet. Socioeconomic issues, which I thought was really interesting. So they talk about poor neighborhoods, wealthier neighborhoods, and then sort of pitying all the people who live in the poorer neighborhoods and things like that. And when they do that, they do it like it's a sort of, what do you call it? Without context, right? It's like the situation is, this is reality. And they never say how government regulations created these very circumstances, right? So they presuppose that poor neighborhoods are poor because of racism, for example, not because of these arbitrary government regulations, which created the circumstances and situations such as the welfare trap. Now, why do I say that? Well, because the neighborhood in which I live has a very, what do you call it? It's said that their school district is very, very strong. And so lots of parents who want good education for their children, they try to move into the neighborhood. And this is why a lot of neighborhoods focus on trying to improve the reputation of the school, because it benefits property owners, right? The more people are trying to get into your neighborhood, it drives up property values. And so it's good for the people who are just sort of sticking around, or people who are flipping houses, whatever. And so people who try to get into the neighborhood, they come into the neighborhood for the school, for their children. And I've had students who went to the school in my district, and then I saw them down in the school where I taught. And they would tell me, yeah, their parents are going to move as soon as their sibling graduates because the school taxes are just simply too high, right? And so there's the phenomena where you see this constant turnover in home ownership because people want to be able to send their kids to that school. A lot of these families are not wealthy. That's the thing. They come up with all these different methods to try to move into the neighborhood. There are older houses in the neighborhood. They try to move into those houses. You see many, many different ways to try to get their kids into a better school district. So I don't buy this socioeconomic argument. People who value education will do what it takes to get their kids into the school that they want them to get into. Also consider, and for all of those other cases where people say, well, no, you can't say that. What about but that doesn't help the people who are already poor. But here's the thing. We've been talking about consequences of choices in nearly every single episode in this channel. This is part of the cost. If you know that your life choices today is going to affect where your kids are going to go to school in the future, would you make the same choices? Does it matter? And so this is part of sort of the unconsidered downside risk of choices made today. And you can't get around it. You can't absolve people of the responsibility, the liability that came with the choices they made when they were younger. So there's that, right? And so most families that I know of try to instill certain values and try to get their kids to think about the future, the consequences of choices made today on their future life. And it is something, right? So basically you're changing the time preference. Instead of immediate gratification, you want to think far into the future. What do I need to do today to be able to achieve the kind of life in the future? And next, we have to realize that schools are constrained and limited by government rules, right? So even private schools are heavily regulated by the government. They have to satisfy all of these different rules and regulations. Um, I know the outside of the city, the big city that I live near, there are so many rules, and all of those rules are stifling, and it ruins the district, right? And so but here's the kicker: because they're the government schools, they're the monopolies. There is no choice. There is no alternative, and so people are stuck, just like any other monopoly. You have to continue to send your kids to a school that teaches badly, that teaches poorly, right? And it has very little less to do about the neighborhood and more to do with how the schools are run. And so you're going to create an alternative argument like, oh, it's racism, it's discrimination, it's redlining, it's all this other kind of stuff, because you don't want people to look at the actual school. It's better to chase a boogeyman for ages, right? Oh, institutional racism, right? And we talked about that before, right? Rather than lazy teachers, overpaid administrators, right? Who wants to say that, right? That's what you want to become a participant in. You want some of that uh, cheddar, as they say. You want some of that money for yourself. And so you can't bring the system down. You want to try to cash in on it. So does the critique come from a desire of something? I've hinted at this before, right? So you can see that people don't like what they see. Why? Because there's something else that they would rather see, right? So voluntary associations are forbidden. Like, you can't sit with your friends. You can't sit with people you want to sit with. You got to sit with these people because that's what you should be doing. That's the right thing. It's like, oh, okay. It's sort of like interracial relationships. Well, sort of tangentially, perhaps. A lot of people will say that they don't see color, right? Which is very interesting, right? So, well, I don't see color, so I date whoever I want. Well, not really, right? And I'm not bashing them. I'm trying to say that usually some people will say that in a society or in a context where interracial relationships are kind of frowned upon, or just, it happens rarely. And so it's a little surprising to some people. And so they try to cover up and they say, well, I'm doing this because I don't see color. I say that it's actually, they do see color and they're turned on by certain ethnicities, which is why they're attracted to them in the first place. But see, we're in a situation where it's sort of unusual or is frowned upon. You got to say something like, oh, I don't see color. So in the same way, you're like, people look at cafeterias and say, oh, this is unacceptable. This is segregation, you know, because they don't like what it is that they see. And so they want to prescribe, uh, the vision that they have in their head. So it's not really a solution. It's just this authoritarian impulse that people who have power very readily confess, expose, and then impose on everybody else. This is the nature of ethnographic study. I'm not the originator of this, but I forget right now who it is that said this. But if you look at studies on ethnic groups, racial groups, whatever, what they write about is what's important to that writer, not what's important to the people they're writing about, but what's important to the writer. And so you saw this throughout all of these articles. The students themselves had no problem, but it's the teachers, it's the scholars who see a problem, right? And that's basically what this is. So all of these academic endeavors is more an indication of the sort of obsessions and sort of the subjective perspectives that the scholars have, not what the people on the ground see, and even what they see and desire for themselves. So in conclusion, if segregation is voluntary, it's none of your business. Okay, move along. Definitely nothing to see here. However, if what we're observing, the segregation that we observe, is coerced, like the kind of coerced segregation that scholars impose on school cafeterias, then you're going to see more problems, right? So segregation as a result of government regulations like districting, school monopolies, right? That creates problems. And so we can see that the constant fiddling, meddling, interference by governments that have to justify their existence, scholars who are trying to get tenure and publishing deals never have a good ending, right? They create more problems uh, than uh, than there were before. And I think that's the goal. The more problems you have, the more it justifies their existence. So the solution again is freedom and less government, right? Less government, more freedom. That's the solution, right? And so segregation becomes a non-issue. That's it for this episode. I will talk to you in the next.